Well, the most striking thing, from my point of view, as an immigrant to America, is that America is a very young nation, very young nation. And one of its great advantages is that it doesn't define itself by some pseudoscientific definition of race or even land. That this myth that the Europeans had, that this was a kind of primitive new world that they discovered, which people didn't live, and that they colonized it, the Spanish, the French, and the British. As European expansion happened, they came to a place and they became colonists. They wanted to build communities that were better than the communities they'd come from, right? So they even had that were religious fanatics. They were just people looking for a better life. And in the Spanish case, they had also the desire to convert the native populations and dominate them through serfdom, sort of a transportation of European feudalism into Latin America, what we call Latin America, Mexico, Peru. And in the United States, the English-speaking, the colonists were content to see the native populations exterminated. They did it by pushing them west through disease and through war, essentially clearing the land of the indigenous people who lived here and setting up their own society. Now, over the 19th century, the volume of immigration became enormous. From Germany, from Italy, from England, from Ireland. And plus the crucial importance of the Black African population that were slaves. And when finally the Civil War happened, and after the Civil War, the question of national identity, who are Americans, couldn't be easily solved the way, let's say, the French managed to invent a kind of uniform French identity. The English had a harder time because they had Scotland and Wales, and, Anglo-Saxon, what was really English. Each of the nations during the 19th century in Europe invented a pure nationality, not historic. There's nothing coherent about it. The Germanic tribes that occupied and eventually defeated the Romans. That's not a coherent culture. It's pseudoscience. Race is a pseudoscientific proposition. It doesn't mean anything. We can identify ourselves as part of a race, but we are more alike than we are different. One of the things people don't want to understand is that what we know about biology, about the genome, about DNA, makes the differences between myself and a person who is a Black American, or my differences between myself and someone who is a Native American, right, an indigenous person. Those differences are statistically small by comparison to what makes us alike. And in fact, the world's population probably derives from a very small corner of Africa and dispersed over the world. So the 19th century invention of national identity, uniformity, sometimes with religion, sometimes without religion. So in Germany, there were Catholic Germans, there were Protestant Germans. But Spain was more uniform because they expelled the Muslims and the Jews, so they became more coherent as Catholic. But this idea to be part of a group, and that group develops the illusion of a national identity. Scottish tartans. This is a 19th century invention of his history. And it isn't actually history. When Italy was unified in 1866, someone from the north who was illiterate couldn't understand someone from the south. There wasn't a common language. In France, only the Napoleonic reforms created a uniform language, even to this day. Now, of course, with television and with most people being literate, you have the situation you have in China. It's all about the Chinese. What does that tell you? Very little. The differences are enormous. And the person who doesn't read Mandarin from the north won't understand someone from the south. Mexico. The Mexican Revolution of 1910, its important agenda was to create a Mexican identity. There was a regional identity. It wasn't a national Mexican identity. And we write history in order to justify this kind of group homogeneity, which is really not what I value. I value that both what is the same between us and what is different. So you have to reconcile individuality with sameness. Now, one of the samenesses, of course, is language. We can speak the same language. You may come from Argentina, someone else comes from Costa Rica, someone from Mexico, and you can hear that their Spanish is different and they have different idioms, but you can converse with them. Right? So we have language in common. And we all are born, and we all die, and we all have diseases, and we live on the same planet. We breathe the same air. We have a lot in common. Our destiny is shared, no matter how different we may be. But in that fundamental base of being common, there are things that bind us together as human beings. And we're forced by necessity to live in political societies. And we want to feel connection to the next person. Music is a very unusual instrument of creating community and also identifying oneself. Because music is a system of communication that is not a language. It doesn't describe anything. You can't describe a tree in music. You can't tell a story in music unless you begin to associate certain rhetoric in music as telling a story. So we now associate certain kind of music with being scary in a horror movie, right? So when we listen to the movie, but we don't see the picture, we know they're not kissing. The people are being attacked or something terrible is happening to them. We can make those very wide differences. But music is very unusual because you as the listener or the performer playing it, whatever instrument, you imagine that it has meaning. You attribute meaning to it, but there's no right or wrong answer. You and I can listen to the same piece of music and think different things about it. To you, it's telling a story of a horse riding across a field, and for me, it's telling a story of a man making an omelet. No, it doesn't, who's right, who's wrong? We both listen to the same music at the same time. We've come up with different conclusions. So music is something we can share in common, but what we make of it, the sense we make of it, is very different. And it's always indeterminate. It's meaningful, but it's indeterminate. And only after the fact do I use language to try to figure out whether you and I have the same impression of it. If we go to a museum and we see a Velázquez, we can both agree as to what's on the picture, right? And if we read a play, a book, we can come to pretty clear agreement about the outlines of what it's all about. And music is unusual because it's indeterminate, even if it has words. Even if it has words. What we feel about it, what we think about it, can be very divergent. Now, in the West, and that has to do with America, in the West, a musical culture was developed, first out of the church, which was notated, written.
Can we cut and start again? Yeah.
So if I wrote a melody, I can write it down and I can send it to you by mail, and you can sing the same melody that I wrote. We never have to meet. Like a book, like publishing, like all notation. It breaks the boundaries of oral communication. Because music is oral, like dance, it's in real time, it's very improvisatory, right? But how do you make a permanent record? The way people used to tell stories. They sang stories, or they told stories around a fireplace, and people remembered the stories, and then they told the stories, they embellished them. That's more or less the way we think Homer was written, that generations of singers kept telling these stories about the Trojan War, and finally somebody wrote them all down. And then once they were written down, people could keep reading them. Now, in music, we created a system of notation. And then these were musical expressions tied to faith in the Catholic Church, in the liturgy of the Mass. And people had the idea, well, they developed a system of expression and of sound to an illiterate population that heard it. And you could write this down, and maybe you could make sounds without the words. And you could, just with instruments and voices, you could make sound and write it down. And but it was unusual of all the arts because it didn't imitate nature. Didn't really imitate nature. It wasn't a picture of a garden or a portrait of a prince. It was also not an embellishment of the experiences of life, the experiences of being in love or dying or being ill or being disappointed, any of the emotions that we have in life, which we can write about. Okay, now, in America, what happened?
Sorry, is it a problem?
The Union side in the Civil War. The German immigration was the largest immigration of the mid-century until the wave of immigration from Italy and from Eastern Europe. Of course, there was the Irish immigration. So these communities, having been uprooted from the places they came, created communities of their own here and invented things that bound them together, language, ancestry. And in the German-speaking community, particularly, but also the English-speaking community, they brought with them the kind of church music that they did, and the dance music that they grew up with. And then they come to America and they meet two populations. One is the indigenous population, and then the slave population and the freed slave population that come from different traditions that come through Africa and sometimes through the Caribbean. And then they meet other European traditions, which they didn't really have much contact with. German immigration from Bavaria or from the Rhineland, meet someone from Sicily or Naples. And they're now in the same place. And the question of what becomes an American identity is easier solved in literature, although 19th century American writers were inevitably connected with the English, Henry James being the most famous example, or Longfellow, or Washington Irving even. And then in painting, the dominant influence was some German. The Hudson River School here has taken its impetus from a German school of landscape genre painting, and of course the Italians and the French. And in music, much the same happens. And what is American becomes an issue only post-Civil War in a serious way, when America emerges as a big industrial international force in the 1890s and 1880s. And for most of that time, Americans have a little bit of an insecurity because they look to Europe as the mature place of high culture. That's where there were Greeks and Romans, and that's where there was the Renaissance, and that's where Raphael and Leonardo da Vinci and Dürer, that somehow this was high culture. This is the world of Shakespeare, of Goethe, of Corneille, Racine, of Cervantes, whatever you want. And what does America have to show for that? Nothing. So the universities and the high culture, the literate population, is looking to Europe to set a standard. And in music, that standard really was first set seriously by the Germans. And so when you look at American composers in the second half of the 19th century, they all train in Germany. They go to German conservatories. And they bring back those techniques of writing music and the idea of a piece of art having a form, the way a composition would be in a painting, that music is an experience you have writing a song with words, or a string quartet, or a symphony, or a piano sonata, as the piano becomes the universal instrument of musical instruction. So in post-Civil War, the modern piano is born, and that's an instrument that you don't have to tune. The democratization of musical culture is essential to this story. Before the modern piano, if you wanted to play any string instrument, guitar, violin, you had to tune it, which means you had to have a pitch recognition. On a violin or cello, you had 4 strings you had to tune in an interval, right? If you don't hear the difference, right, you can't tune the instrument. And there are no frets, which means if I want to play do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, I have to put my fingers in the right place that it sounds right. I have to sing it, the same ability to sing, as we say, carry a tune. And musical ability is not uniformly distributed. It means it requires more or less teaching. The piano was a miracle, because the piano was the first instrument of mechanical reproduction that was reliable. The American piano of the 1860s and 70s had a metal frame a very secure pin block, and it didn't go out of tune every day. When Mozart got up every morning and he had his fortepiano, he had to tune it every single day. Tuned it so he could use it, right? Now I buy a piano, I can't hear the difference between a second, a third, a fourth, or a fifth. I can't hear that. So I need something that won't go out of tune if I'm going to play my little. Suddenly, I have an instrument that's stable. I have to tune every 6 months, every 3 months. It's like my car. I don't know how to build a car. Do you know? I put my key in, I turn it on, and it runs. Now, when it breaks, I can't fix it myself. I call someone to fix it. That's what the piano was. It worked until it didn't, and then you called someone in who was a piano tuner or a piano mechanic and fixed it. But in the meantime, I could play tunes without hearing the pitches naturally or reproducing them by the numbers, like typing or painting by the numbers. Put my first finger, third finger. So music instruction became broadly possible through the modern piano. And how did people entertain themselves? Dancing, singing. And then there were public music events. And America wanted them. And that begins to have a public for an orchestra, which is a wonderful experience. Going to an orchestra concert in the 1880s was like going to the movies in the 1950s. Technicolor, big sound, exciting. It could have been stupid, but it was an hour and a half of complete detachment from reality. And there was a symphony by the Russian composer Anton Rubinstein called the Ocean Symphony. And it described, first it had 4 movements, and then it ended up with 7 movements. So each big body of water around the globe had a kind of movement. The Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, the Indian Ocean. And so it was a kind of travelogue through sound. And people sat in their seats and they daydreamed. What has been the death of the classical music concert? Not rock and roll, not hip hop, not rap. The sound movie. Because suddenly I bought a ticket, place was dark, and I exited into fantasy land with language and sound. Before the sound movie, there was a so-called silent movie, which was never silent. There was always somebody playing music, right? Okay, so that was fun, but this was much better. That's why a symphony concert was just a sensual experience. You had all these noises coming from the stage, which were beautiful and sort of transported you. Okay. Now, so already in the 1840s, because the Philharmonic had started before the Civil War, but in the big cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, these were the places where, and then ultimately Chicago, where symphonic music and opera really took off in the United States. And it was all started by visiting Europeans. Jenny Lind came on a concert tour, and a lot of Europeans came to these, descendants of Europeans, and they were paid a fortune to do so. Later in the story, Gustav Mahler becomes music director of the New York Philharmonic. They paid him an unbelievable fortune. The more important person was Dvořák, who was paid a king's ransom to head up a conservatory in New York of music. Right? The Europeans set the standards, and they made the tours, and they raked in the money. And the audiences were made of aspiring middle-class people who had learned to play as a hobby, the same way as sports today. All the crazy European fans for football, they've all played football as kids, right? In the street, in the backyard. That's why they like it. I don't like it because I don't understand it. Never played football. It doesn't mean anything. I see a lot of people running back and forth for no apparent reason. And why am I sitting there? I don't understand what's going on. So why should I sit there? But if you played and you see how great these players are and what they can do and how magnificent, it's exciting, right? Why did President Obama love basketball because he played basketball, which means he could look at a professional basketball player and say, wow, that's great. You know, that's great. I understand why that's great because I've tried to do the same thing and I can't do it quite the same way. The same way as people went to concerts. You know, they play the piano at home and then they watch this person come in and does all this fantastic stuff and they think, my God, that's fantastic, right? And singers and violinists, so forth. So, you're a natural audience. And the question is, suddenly America becomes self-consciously patriotic. We have a national anthem, right? It doesn't become a national anthem until the 20th century, but it's a national hymn, right? And on the concert in which we did the Niagara Symphony of Bristow, we opened with Dudley Buck's overture on the Star-Spangled Banner. I chose it for a reason. Now, he was a composer too, and a lot of these composers had church jobs, a lot of them, but not all of them, and most of them, as I said, went to Europe to train. Now, Bristow was unusual in that he didn't, but he's one of the earliest. He was a member of the New York Philharmonic, and he rightly had the idea, you know, we should be writing our own music, which reflects our own experience, taking the European vocabulary, right? It's like our English. American English is different from British English, and American English is different from Australian English, and American English is different from South African English, right? But if you take the analogy into music, so I'm a German descendant, and the music in my family or the music in my church, the hymns are by Martin Luther or J.S. Bach, and so I think, well, what's my contribution? What's different about what the music I'm going to write? What's going to be different about it? So they begin to look at landscape and history. And they begin to look a little bit on music that didn't have a European origin. It was from Africa, or was indigenous to the United States from the Native American peoples, and the sounds and the instruments. So Bristow, interestingly,
do you mind if we start at Bristow after a cut?
Yeah, okay.
Please cut.
So Bristow does the natural thing. I've only performed 2 Bristow symphonies. The Niagara and the 3rd symphony, each of which has a different title to its movement. It's a sort of a manifest destiny symphony in which it describes also a Native American Indian dance, a war dance is the scherzo movement, and it's an effort to use a Central European musical vocabulary to evoke the American character, history, and landscape. So there is, a very stereotypical Native American dance kind of rhythm in the 3rd movement. The 1st movement sort of has a kind of honest lyrical simplicity about the sort of growth of America and its destiny to command the entire continent. So it has a kind of a historical moral tale behind it. But what it is music that is very much in the style of Mendelssohn, Schumann, Brahms, if you can say, sort of Central European, conservative, anti-Wagnerian harmonic and melodic language. So it takes the forms that were developed in Europe and tries to invest them with some kind of American feeling, which is catchy tunes, easily comprehensible tunes, a lot of excitement and brilliance, because the Europeans had contempt for America. In the mid-19th century, America stood for just material wealth. All Americans were concerned about was the mighty dollar. We were the height of materialism, as opposed to the spiritual objectives of other places, Europe. But by the time 1898 rolls around, when the last of the Bristow, the Niagara Symphony is written, some things have really begun to change. And the biggest change in American musical history is probably the arrival of Anton and Dvořák to the United States in the 1890s to lead a national conservatory funded by Mrs. Thurber in New York. He doesn't stay very long, but he has a huge impact. He lives mostly among the Czech immigrant community, both in New York and in Spillville, Iowa. But he has a fantastic insight. And in his first class were, among others, two Black American composers, Harry Burleigh and Will Marion Cook. And each of them made a huge contribution, in Burleigh's case, to a lot of church music, and in Will Marion Cook to the development of what we now call the American musical. The minstrel show turned into kind of what was the Broadway musical. But Dvořák's insight was pretty simple. He said, if you want to make a music of your own that contributes to your sense of national identity, of group identity, you have to draw from the things that are unique to America. And they were, in his mind, the African-American legacy, from Africa through the slaves and the freed slaves, and the indigenous, the tribes that lived on the land. I would put a third aspect to that, which was the idea of the landscape, the immensity of the American landscape, things like the Grand Canyon, Niagara Falls, the Great Lakes, the Mississippi River, Yellowstone, the Rockies. This kind of, what's very special about light and space in America. And the other thing, adding to Dvořák's two elements, is the idea of democracy. That's something very unusual. And does that have a way to be expressed in music? And one of those ways of expressing it is to avoid too learned a pattern of music making. In other words, that kind of a simplicity, a directness, which is how America succeeds so terribly well with the Broadway tune, people like Gershwin, and jazz, of course, comes with the African-American Black experience, but music that is quickly accessible and very direct. And so he basically, Dvořák tells Americans, look to your own distinct backyard. Don't imitate Europe. And Bristow's generation became obsolete quickly. So George Frederick Bristow was a name that I'd only seen in a textbook. I'd never heard a line of his music, knew nothing about him, except that he existed, and he played an important role in the development of classical music. I didn't know a line of his music. And the first American composers I encountered as a musician growing up were 20th century American composers. They were Charles Ives, George Gershwin, Aaron Copland. They were living parts of the 20th century. I couldn't name you a single 19th century American composer. I never played any music by any of them. And I only knew they existed by history, in a history book. And it's only in the effort to create a coherent history that people have gone back and said, well, they were a real composer, and they're right. So I first encountered American 19th century music when we did a Dvořák festival, and encountered his pupils, and then realized that, there were composers in the 19th century, Knowles Paine, Ives's teacher, Horatio Parker at Yale, Edward MacDowell here at Columbia University. I remember doing a concert in Germany of all American composers for the 19th century. This is maybe 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And the program consisted of Knowles Paine, Edward MacDowell, and George Chadwick, who was a big force in American music in Boston. And the response of the orchestra and of the press in Germany was, this is all very curious, but it's second-rate European music, basically. That's what they said. And interestingly, the music I used, the scores and parts, were published by German publishers, by Breitkopf and Peters. So the Russian, German, Italian, French dominance of the classical music world, except in certain areas where classical music and other music began to bleed together, and that was in circus music, for example. When the circus came to town, they had opera tunes, and in varying bowdlerized versions, opera was a popular art form. It was sort of musical theater and dance, and then eventually things like the vaudeville show. America created its own entertainment, which had music. And, of course, dance music, ragtime, and then they developed jazz. But so performing and recording Bristow's music is a very important thing to do, because these are not necessarily composers that should be entirely forgotten. So 20 or 30 years ago, there was a concerted effort, especially as recording became more ubiquitous and cheaper to do. And people began to record Chadwick string quartets, Chadwick symphonies, Knowles Paine music, Edward MacDowell. The piano concertos were for a while out there. But the truth is that they have never commanded major public attention, important as they have been historically. No one is doing music by these composers today. You won't find a Chadwick symphony on the program of the Boston Symphony. You won't find a Paine overture or any other piece. There's some pioneers like Gunther Schuller, the late genius performer and composer. He was an advocate of Knowles Paine. But the history of American music is basically now gone silent, even into the 20th century. We don't hear much of Ives, and certainly we don't hear anything by Sessions or Carter or Leo Siegmeister or Walter Piston or any of the enormous number of fine composers that worked in the 20th century in America, many of them influenced by European styles. Some come around, Lou Harrison, then the experimentalist John Cage, but in this world, the interest is in living composers, which is good. And the history is a little influenced by the direction of the living composers, so modernism is out of fashion. But if people want to hear old music, they'll go to old masters. They're not going to go to George Bristow. They're not going to go to John Knowles Paine. There is a tragedy to that, because my encounter with the Bristow symphonies is very positive. It was exciting for me and for the players to learn and put on the stage a very well-written, very beautiful, very fine piece of music that told something about America's image of itself, kind of triumphant, confident America, which no longer exists. And in many of these pieces, you do hear a democratic ethos, the idea of writing for a large public where there is no landed aristocracy. Now, we have a country now that has oligarchs, but we've returned to a feudal world, but that's an iron of history which we need to help undo. But the sort of hint of egalitarianism you can see in the clarity and the simplicity, if you will, of Bristow's form and his tunes and what he does with orchestration. It's music that can be liked on first hearing. It's like going to an enjoyable film. Is it the greatest film ever made? Probably not. But was it worth the hour and a half? Certainly it was. Would you watch it again? Yes. Now, given the economics of what it costs to put on a live performance, most of these pieces now exist. A lot of this American music has been recorded, not as much Bristow. But as recordings come up, people can go on YouTube or Spotify or whatever platform they want and listen to it. It isn't the same as hearing a piece live. You can't record a symphony orchestra, really. But it's a reference, like having a reproduction of a book of a painting by Leonardo da Vinci. Not the painting, but the representation of it. And so, like the fine scholars that spent their time, studying Bristow, it's important that if you have a child and the child says, so what was music like in America in the 19th century? You can say, well, there were, very fine colored generations of American composers, and here you can listen to some of their music, and you might like it. I was amazed, for example, I did a concert with the American Symphony Orchestra in the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, and the theme of the concert was music in New York during Mahler's tenure as the music director of the New York Philharmonic. Now, Mahler is the composer whose symphonic work is the most played nowadays in major symphony orchestras, right? If not Mahler, it's Beethoven, Brahms. He's in the top three. So he wrote a 10th symphony, which he never completed. One movement he did complete, and autobiographically, he worked on it while he was in New York, and one of the events that seems to have motivated him is a funeral of a fireman who died, and it was on Central Park West, and it went by their apartment in this hotel that they lived in. And they watched, Alma and Gustav Mahler were watching this parade with a band, with the memorial parade for this fireman. Anyway, so I did the Adagio movement of the Mahler 10 together with music that he programmed, American music that he programmed when he was in his last seasons here. Composers like Hadley and Chadwick. And then I did a piece by a Dutch admirer, Alphonse Diepenbrock. Now these are names nobody's ever heard of, right? Certainly Diepenbrock.
No.
And it's very good music. It's very good music. But there's no time, it seems, and there's no money and no time to put this on the stage. It's one of the tragedies of music, that our museum requires time and requires living people. You just can't hang it on the wall. And going back to notation, if people could read music, they could read it the way they read a book. And you wouldn't need a recording and performance, right? We don't need someone to get up and do a production of Hamlet to appreciate Hamlet. We can read it, right? Well, literacy in music hasn't come to that point. So we have something equivalent. We can turn on YouTube and listen to it. But are people motivated to do that? I'm not so sure. But it's music that is worth preserving, and it's a good thing that Catherine Preston, for example, written a biography of Bristow, and he was very admirable in the variety of things he did, teach school, and he really did. It was a kind of Johnny Appleseed of classical musical culture. And is it American? Yes. So I would close by making an analogy with modern China today. Right? So you go to China. I've been there many times.
Okay with I mean, I can't believe that we have so much room on the card.
The card is free. Let's pause.
China.
Okay, so you go to China, you go to the Central Conservatory in Beijing, and Shanghai, any city, and you hear fantastic musicians who are playing classical Western music, musical instruments. But at the same time, there is a development of a music that's a synthesis of traditional Chinese music and Western music, a merger of historic Chinese instruments with their different tonal and pitch structures and rhythmic structures, and Western music. And you have suddenly a reinvention of music that was once European that becomes part of Chinese culture and identity, just as it did in Japan or in Korea. That's the great thing about music, because music is, unlike language, not tethered completely to a specific cultural history or history of place. It is capable of being reinvented and yet be itself in different places by different generations and understood differently. So it's a wonderful art form for that reason. And I mean, there are cliches which seem to be culturally identified as, because of their scale structures, as Indian music or Chinese music or Korean music or Western music. But there is certainly out of the Western musical tradition, because of the notation and the reproducibility and the transmission of that cultural tradition, it can be integrated into new generations in new places and be reinvented. Among the most interesting music being written today is being written by cultures from the Asian world that have absorbed and integrated Western classical traditions in their vocabulary.
Yeah.
So the modern iron cast frame piano with a modern pin block and the way the soundboard is secured and the way the frame of the piano is laminated. The modern piano, which revolutionized piano sound and also instrumental sound in Europe, that was a technological contribution that made a difference, yes. Berlioz is the composer who points this out for the first time, which he says that in the way the three-strung modern piano makes intervals sound, it's easier to write chromatic music, right? Which it sort of expands the harmonic range in the Western system, makes modulation not more efficient, but could be more rapid and more pleasing to the ear. It democratizes access as well, obviously. But so, yes, the real influence of America in European music comes after the First World War, and that is with jazz. That is the most important and most dramatic impact that America has on European music, and that's in the 20s.
Okay, Scott.
Or the audiences in the later part of the century, 1890s. They came from all over. So the answer is that the acquisition of musical culture, being interested enough to go to a concert, to listen to a Beethoven, or go to a Wagner opera, right? This is the period when Anton Seidl is the conductor in New York, and the Met Opera gets more and more attention. So anybody who's interested in the arts, there are two competing tendencies. One is towards snobbery and refined taste, so in a culinary way. I won't drink any wine that isn't from this and that place or this in this vintage. Snobbery. That's one possibility. The other possibility is a curiosity. So, I've learned to play some Mozart sonatas, and I've learned to play some Haydn or some Beethoven, and there's Mendelssohn and Schumann. That's where children learning the piano. That's a repertoire. But I get curious about what's being written now. I don't want to do what my parents did. I don't do what my grandparents did. I'm proud of that tradition, but I also want to do something new. And there's an obvious question: what's different about the place I'm now in from where I came from? So, as I may have mentioned, I had an older brother who recently died, and he gave an interview and talked about he was 7 and 8 years of age when he came here, and he did everything in his power to erase the fact that he came from Europe. He wanted to be American. He wanted to have a black leather jacket. He wanted to join the Boy Scouts. He wanted to be part of the imagined majoritarian culture that existed. and that was true of many, many immigrants. So the majoritarian culture was not really German, it was English, pseudo-English, let's say. And Americans aped, especially in Boston and Massachusetts, aped of English, the priority of English literary manners, let's say. But then there were Americans who were fiercely determined to do something different from the mother country. This was a nation without an aristocracy. This is a nation with a particular kind of landscape. This is a nature with a particular kind of commitments to personal freedom and religious freedom and various kinds of things. So you have a 19th century that's filled by very aggressive spokespeople on what's distinctly American. Emerson, the Transcendentalists, these are people who were convinced that they were in a new place. Jefferson was convinced that this was a place that had to develop a culture that was distinctive from the European. That they go hand in hand. And language acquisition, was very important. But in New York, for example, there were, in far as Buffalo, New York, there were singing societies that were in imitation of the German choral societies of the 1840s, men's choral societies, and they sang some traditional German men's chorus kinds of things, but they also sang new stuff that was written for them by Americans. So it can't be reduced so simply. Then you have later generations who want to rediscover their past, and they invent a past which never really existed as their heritage. So it's a complex dynamic. And then it changes in America. Well, you know it from Latin America. In Latin America, there was a fantastically large Italian immigration to Argentina. And also to Brazil. And there you have Latin American composers who are writing Latin American versions of Italian opera. In other words, they're trying to adapt what they knew to a new circumstance. There was a huge Russian and Polish Eastern European and then also Italian immigration in New York, which influenced dramatically what was played and heard in New York.
You mentioned the Italians in Brazil. Carlos